I'll quickly introduce the group here. Dave Bissell, who I think many of you saw yesterday, who is the president and CEO of KIUC. Ron Whitmore, who is, because I just met Ron late yesterday, Deputy Director for Department of Research and Development for the County of Hawaii. And Kyle Data, who I've known for many years, the general partner for Ulupono Initiative. And Kyle is going to frame the debate, and then we're going to turn it over for questions. But Dave and I were talking off before we came on, and we both come from rather rural areas, so we actually understand the problems that rural grids face. And I live part-time up on the Northern California coast, and we've been without electricity for as long as 8 days. So I'm painfully aware of what rural places go through. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Kyle to frame the debate.
So the ubiquitous advent of distributed energy and variable energy poses challenges to the electrical system for all utilities in 3 ways. There's the engineering challenge of integrating these technologies on the grid. There's the financial challenge of the revenue erosion that comes from these technologies to the balance sheets of the incumbents. There's a regulatory challenge of how do we set the rules in a way that both allows capital formation at the utility, independent power, and customer levels, but also sets pricing that's fair and equitable and can be transactionally administered in a way that makes sense. So the urban states are addressing these challenges by trying to take their successes in developing markets at the wholesale level and pushing them back down in very sophisticated ways to the retail grid level, to the distribution grid, and having these work simultaneously. And while that works well for them, there are differences in the rural states that make that harder for us. It's just to mimic those solutions. Most importantly, we have to recognize that in rural states, we may not have the number of participants in any markets that we may create, no matter how good the design, to have liquidity in those markets. And of course, that becomes a real problem. The other kinds of issues we have to recognize that rural states tend to have poor populations, so affordability is an important issue that we have to really recognize is going to impact us even more than the urban areas. And then we also face some unique challenges. We're not trying to bring power into constrained urban areas that are transmission constrained and solve that problem of reliability. We actually have very dispersed populations along these very long lines in distant areas. We're trying to keep them served reliably. So it's a different set of problems that we're facing. So the conversation this morning is, what makes sense for us? What's practical? What's the right level of relationships to allow these different forces to work together that makes sense for the rural states, and then Hawaii in specific we can use as an example.
So move on to, I think it's important to hear from the Big Island and Kauai because they're facing these problems right now. So I'll turn to Dave first to talk about his experiences on Kauai.
Well, thank you, and thanks, Kyle, for framing that. One other obvious point on the Hawaiian Islands is not only are we rural, but we're isolated and not interconnected to any grid, which is totally dissimilar than most mainland areas where they may be small, but they're tied into a massive grid. That takes away a lot of the margin of error that you have of operating a utility. You're totally dependent on yourself. You have to manage supply and demand every second of the day. You can't have outages. There's nobody to back you up if there's a problem. So the pressure to perform and keep reliability up is much more intense for us than really anywhere else in the country, with the possible exception of Alaska. So a lot of the reliability has to be at the forefront of everything you do, which is really, I think, a differentiating side for us in Hawaii.
And now turning to Ron, I'm familiar with the Big Island. I've run a number of projects there in one of my past incarnations. So I turn to Ron. Again, very large landmass, not a lot of people. Kind of let us know what you think about the Big Island.
Thank you, Terry, and I want to thank the panel and Verge for having Hawaii County here today. Mayor Kim was invited, and he sends his regrets. And neither Harry Kim or myself are energy experts, so I come to this panel at a bit of a disadvantage. However, we both come from the same value-based, focused on community development. Harry Kim talks a lot about making Hawaii County, Hawaii Island, a great place to live, and if you make it a great place to live, it's a great place to visit, and if you do those first two things, it's a great place to do business. And so a lot of our focus in Hawaii County is high quality of life for our residents. We face many challenges. Kyle and Dave have touched on many of them related to energy. We, from an economic perspective, have some of the lowest median income rates and some of the highest poverty rates. And so in addition to being concerned about stability of the system and diversity of the system and a strong commitment to renewables and the Paris Accords, we also have a strong focus on the whole question of cost and affordability. And so I was really encouraged yesterday, first of all, hearing from DBED in the morning session based on the charge from the ledge to look seriously at business models. Very interested, particularly in Hawaii County, about alternative business models so that we can really strike a better balance between renewables and affordability. Also very encouraged by what I heard from the the Public Utilities Commissioners and their dedication clearly to balancing those two pieces, as well as from the utilities, their commitment now to engaging their customers in a very meaningful way. And so we're very interested in using the advances in technology, the advances in economic systems and political structures to really begin talking about the democratization, not just of energy, but the democratization of decision-making related to energy, and the democratization of the wealth and the benefits that are reaped from our energy systems. And so we look forward to engaging the utilities and the PUC in those conversations moving forward, very much part of the DBED exploration of business models. So.
Oh, thank you. Back to Kyle, Ulupono is doing, in my mind, a number of very exciting things. And for Kyle, what are some of the things that you're doing that might be addressing these problems in the islands here other than Oahu?
Well, we're trying to partner with, of course, the utilities and technology providers to help bring the kind of innovative technologies that we think would help the grid situation. We announced the partnership with Nelha and Helco and Sandia around the UET flow battery as an example of some of the things that we're doing. But I also want to pick up on your point about the business models and it's good that Dave's here representing a co-op, because clearly one of the things that's advantageous, and you see this a lot in rural areas, you have a lot of co-ops, and of course they're more aligned because of the way that the co-op model works. But one of the questions is, how do we, when you have an IOU, create that same kind of alignment? And it seems like there's sort of two different questions that arise. One is when the utility is putting in capital, do the same boundaries we used to have where the utility puts everything on this side of the meter and other people put something on the other side of the meter, are those the right boundaries? We should, I think, open the door to say, well, maybe they should be allowed to play in certain ways on the other side of the meter, and the implications of that. We should also look about when other people are putting in the technology, so they're taking the capital risk. Are there ways to address some of the revenue erosion questions when you know that this is the right thing to do, to have other people put it in? And I think there's some interesting things we can remember and learn from the same problem we had when we were working with energy efficiency 2 decades ago. We have to look back at the issue of, can we put in shared saving mechanisms, whether they're looking at the difference between the utilities avoided costs, including the grid costs, versus what the customer has put in, and there's a difference there. That's positive should the utility get some share of that savings. And then there's the thing that California just did, which is an interesting concept, which is another party is putting in the suite of technologies that everyone agrees is the right suite, it's beneficial. Should the utility be allowed to earn a rate of return for the procurement of those? And so they're bringing some of that in almost as, bringing the service in almost as a rate base. And that's another way to start to address some of the challenges that an IOU has that a co-op doesn't have the same sort of issues. But I think since we recognize we're going to have a mix in rural areas of both IOUs and co-ops, there's a lot of thinking that needs to be done about how do we align the incentives for the shareholders so that everyone's on the same page, the way the co-ops, in fact, typically are.
So picking up on that, looking at what KIUC is doing, it's some of those things, because obviously you've been very aggressive. The amount of renewable energy that essentially electricity being provided by renewable resources has gone up dramatically over the recent years. But how does that build into some of these economic issues that Kyle's raised, and what are some of the solutions? And then the other thing that, because it's important with these rural networks, how are you addressing resiliency and the fragility of the system?
Okay, I'll try to handle all those, but come back to
One
me
at
if
a
I miss
time.
one.
Yeah, okay.
So first of all, as a co-op in a rural area, a relatively rural area, there's a co-op is owned by the membership. So everybody that pays us for their electricity is a member, and they elect a director. There's 9 directors at KIUC, 3 are elected every year, so there is a direct democracy. And ultimately, that really carries forward into what we're doing, what technologies we endorse, going aggressively for renewables. It's because our membership wants that. And in a rural area, they have the direct ability to reach out and touch and talk to the directors that are representing them. And those directors aren't shy about coming to me and my staff about saying, hey, here's what the people want, here's what we need to do. Comes up by doing that, we end up with a very strong strategic plan. We take it out to our membership, we get feedback on it, approve it, and then it's up to me and my staff to go forward and make it happen. And in Kauai, it's worked. On the mainland, there's over 900 co-ops, predominantly in rural areas, and it works. And a lot of that is, I think, in the rural areas, people do want to participate. They want to share in the decision making. And by having that shared decision making, you tend to make better decisions. And also, particularly on renewable development and development in general, we can afford to take a longer term outlook on our decision making. We can work projects that may take 8 years, may take 10 years or more, but we decide it's the right thing to do. And we don't have the pressure of shareholders wanting quarterly returns. We have the pressure of just delivering on a long-term strategic plan. So I think that helps out in rural areas in particular, where some of the development may be complex because of the geographic layout. But the democratic control is definitely there. It helps with the project development by having a strong message carried forward all the way from the man on the street up through the CEO of the company. So it works.
Okay, so to Ron, and this is a slightly changing into a different question, but a number of years ago when Harry Kim was mayor, about 10, 12 years ago, I worked with him on a homeland security project related to emergency planning. So it's a different way of getting back at looking at resiliency and the fragility of the system. So in your role, how do you address these things, working with the utility and just overall looking at resiliency and fragility of the system?
In Hawaii County, our energy program focuses really on 3 areas. One is fundamentally emergency preparedness. So we work closely with the utility and the Civil Defense Agency to ensure that people have power when needed and we get it back online when it goes down due to emergencies. The other 2 areas of focus are really on engagement and innovation. We don't have the benefit of having direct local control over our energy system, but we have made strong efforts to demonstrate in practice the opportunities for innovation in transportation, lighting, closed loop energy systems. So we've got models at our West Hawaii Civic Center, island-wide LED lighting, and experiment a lot with transportation as well, alternative fuels, hybrids, electric vehicles, and now thanks to university, hydrogen. And on the engagement side, we've been very active in engaging through the docket system in advocating for the benefits of our ratepayers. If I could add to that, just following up on some of what Dave said, one thing I appreciate about the model there is not only have they been successful at ramping up renewables, but they've been able to level out and even drop to some extent rates at the same time. And I'm not wedded to any particular business model, and I understand there'd be a tremendous challenge in moving from the existing investor-owned system. But I think even within that model, there's opportunities to be really creative, given the advances in technology, not just on the big data and analytics side, but also in terms of how technology can be used to really support and drive good decision making. We now have opportunities to have much greater transparency in our decision making based on good information about all the costs and benefits across the board to all the players. And so we can make good decisions based on a clear understanding of the trade-offs, the benefit and costs, and really be clear about the question of who pays and who benefits, right? And I think it's those sort of tools and mechanisms that should be used moving forward, and I'll encourage DBED to do this as we explore in a very objective way the benefits and costs of different business models.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm going to defer to Elaine now because my next question was not going to provide for short answers. So Elaine, do you have questions?
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about policies and regulatory structures and different kinds of business models, but we're also interested in microgrids and community-based renewables and things like that. Is the future of rural renewable electricity community-based renewables and microgrids, or some sort of combination of that? Or are you seeing other more promising technologies at scale for the more isolated areas?
We look at microgrids and community-based renewables as really what our entire co-op provides. We're a small island, a small grid, and we're able to really balance the benefits of bringing direct shared cost savings from projects we deploy with the ability to do large enough projects that we can bring in at the lowest cost. So we have nobody else, there's no other interest in a co-op. We don't have shareholders, nobody on the outside. So everything we do ultimately is for all the consumers on our system. So we strongly believe that the large-scale, low-cost renewables that can be brought on are a community-based system, and it really is a microgrid because you can get direct benefits immediately when you bring in this lowest cost option. It really comes from our side. We're not wound up whether the utility does projects, whether they're done behind or in front of the meter. We're wound up with getting the most effective, lowest cost energy onto our system. And we've got fairly significant concerns about the rate making in place today, that it doesn't send the proper message and signals out to ratepayers to deploy capital effectively. But outside of that, as long as it's effectively deployed, proper pricing signals, so whatever makes the most sense, we're for. We don't have to make a profit. We don't have to keep shareholders happy. So it's just doing sensible economic investment is really our overriding concern.
I want to build on Dave's point. I think microgrids arise for one of two reasons. The first is that customer needs an extra level of reliability, and that's why you see, say, the military bases will form microgrids for very, very obvious and good reasons, for national security. And you'll see that in other places too. The second is if the incumbent utility fails to provide the level of service and pricing and risk management that the customers want. In Dave's case, he's providing everything the customers want and need, so they don't have the need. But you can see, going back to Big Island, one of the reasons that you had that ferment when prices were at about $100 a barrel of oil prices back in the 2013 period with Paniolo Power, and really looking hard at the question of a microgrid, was because the savings from renewables at that time, collectively, had you accelerated it, would exceed the market value of Helco, right? So there's obviously more than a $20 bill. There's more like a several $100 million bill laying on the ground. And so that led people to think, well, what if we did this ourselves? And in fact, the numbers worked out pretty well that they could. And that was an important, I think, wake-up call to everyone to say, if the utility doesn't make that shift and provide, and the customers will actually take action unto themselves for economic reasons, and also get some reliability benefits as well. Because the other thing that's interesting about rural areas is they actually tend to be very rich in renewable resources because they have a lot of space. Think of the entire Midwest, the Western states, all of our states. So they have those resources there.
And that's
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, and actually, to kind of go to Ron, is that there was a bill before that didn't get to the governor, but NELHA was actually looking at developing a microgrid on the Big Island where they would have been working with HELCO because they would have had to use HELCO lines. They would have kind of been keeping in touch with the PUC and also working with the tenants at NELHA. And it seemed to me that that could have worked. But more broadly for the Big Island, what do you think?
Well, again, I'll defer the technology questions to these guys, but I think there's some interesting lessons to look at from a similar experience we've had on the household level, right? Fully supportive of decentralization of authority and control, but got to be careful on the equity question as well. So what we saw with the PV, household PV in particular, is those who could afford to, those who could, opted in, saved themselves lots of money, but then it leaves the rest of the ratepayers on the system with the burden of supporting the entire system. And so one concern we'd want to watch out for moving forward with microgrids and other sorts of decentralization of the power generation system is let's not, preserve and save costs for the few at the expense of the many.
Okay, well, with that, we're actually a minute ahead, but they said they were running behind, so I think I'll thank everybody for being here. So thanks very much for listening to us.